They say the Inquisition never forgets, and I learned that truth not in the moment they came for me, but in the 37 days afterward, when I understood they had been watching all along. I was Administrator Lexical 4th Class Morton Vess, stationed in the sub-archives of Hive Tertius, on a world whose name I was instructed to forget during my initial conditioning. My work was monotonous in the way only Imperial bureaucracy can make monotonous cataloging data scrolls that detailed grain shipments from a dozen agri-worlds, each entry requiring 6 stamps of authentication, each stamp requiring a prayer of verification, each prayer requiring the proper inclination of the head. I had performed this work for 11 years. I was good at it. I took pride in the precision of my ledgers, in the way my quill never blotted, in how I could recite the liturgy of the fourth approval without consulting the manual. The first sign should have been the smell, not the usual smell of the archives, that mixture of aged parchment, machine oil from the conveyors, and the sharp tang of low stick smoke that drifted down from the levels where the senior lexicographers worked. This was different. Sweeter. Like incense, but wrong somehow, as if the sacred unguents used in the chapel of St. Margrave had been mixed with something that had rotted in the dark. I noticed it on a market day, when the shifts changed and the archives filled with the shuffle of robes and the clink of ident chains. No one else seemed to register it. I mentioned it to Pavel, my desk neighbor, a man whose face was so unremarkable I sometimes forgot what he looked like between shifts. He'd sniffed the air, shrugged, and returned to his authenticating. I should have known then. Pavel never shrugged. Pavel was a man who filled out forms to request permission to fill out other forms. The smell intensified over the following week, settling into the fabric of my robes, clinging to my hair, embedding itself in my throat so that I tasted it with every swallow. I began to dream of flowers, which was strange because I had never seen flowers except in picked captures. In the dreams, the flowers grew from the data scrolls, their roots threading through the parchment, their petals the color of old blood. When I woke, my mouth was full of sweetness, and I would retch into the communal basin until my throat burned. On the 14th day, I found the mark. It was small, barely visible, a symbol etched into the corner of my workstation, just beneath where I rested my wrist when I wrote. 8-pointed. I knew what it meant. Everyone knew what it meant. I had stamped requisition orders for the Arbites, who burned such symbols from the lower hive levels. I had authenticated reports describing the purges. Yet here it was, fresh, the metal still showing silver where it had been scraped. My hands shook so badly I dropped my quill, and the ink splattered across a shipping manifest worth someone's monthly ration allowance. Pavel looked at me. His eyes were different, not the watery grey I remembered, but darker, with something moving in the depths. I didn't report it. This is where my guilt begins. In that moment of cowardice, when I took a file sheet and laid it over the mark, when I requisitioned cleaning servitors to scrub my station, when I pretended not to notice that the symbol returned each morning, slightly larger, cut slightly deeper. I told myself I would report it after I finished cataloguing the Tertullian tithe records. Then after I completed the quarterly verification. Then after I determined who else might be involved, because surely I was not the only one. This reasoning felt sensible then. Now I understand it was the first stage of the rot, the moment when the Inquisition's true work began, not in their arrival, but in the corruption of my own reason. The smell became unbearable on the 23rd day. It was no longer confined to the archives, but followed me through the hab blocks, into the nutrient dispensary, even into the communal prayer cells where we gathered for evening devotions. I knelt on the cold stone, the words of the Imperial litany on my lips, and all I could taste was that cloying sweetness, like honey poured over meat, left too long in the warmth. The priest's voice seemed to come from very far away, and when I looked at the other supplicants, I saw their mouths moving but heard nothing except a low humming, like the sound of flies on the corpse grinders in the lower levels. One of the supplicants, a woman whose name I never learned, turned to look at me, and her face was crawling with something. Not literally, not in the way I could point to and name, but crawling nonetheless, her features shifting like wax near flame. I ran. I am not proud of this. I abandoned my prayer position and fled through the corridors, my robes tangling around my legs, my breath coming in ragged gasps that echoed off the riveted metal walls. Behind me, I heard laughter, though when I glanced back, the prayer cell was empty, the candles still burning steady and gold. I ran until I reached my hab unit, a 6x8 cell containing a cot, a locker, and a small shrine to the Emperor whose face had been worn smooth by generations of kisses. I locked the door useless. I know now, but humans cling to their rituals, and sat on the cot until my breathing steadied. That night, I examined myself in the small mirror above the wash basin. My face looked the same, thin, colorless, with the slightly pinched expression common to archive workers who spend their lives in recycled air. But my eyes had changed. The color was still brown, the same muddy shade I had inherited from my mother, but there was something behind them, watching, using me as a window. I pressed my palms against the mirror until the glass fogged, until I could no longer see what looked back. The next morning, there was a notice on my workstation, official administratum parchment, sealed with red wax bearing the skull and cog. It requested my presence in sublevel 7, room of verifications, at the 16th hour. The language was cordial, almost friendly. Your expertise is required for a specialized audit. I had never been to sublevel 7. I had never heard of the room of verifications. When I asked Pavel, still hoping, pathetically, that this was routine, he looked at me with those wrong eyes and smiled. His teeth were too white, too even, too many. The hours until the 16th crawled past with the speed of continents. I worked mechanically, my hands performing their duties while my mind spiraled through scenarios, each worse than the last. An audit could mean anything. It could mean promotion. It could mean reassignment. It could mean they had discovered my failure to report the symbol. It could mean they had discovered something worse, something I didn't even know I had done. The Imperial bureaucracy is vast enough to contain sins you don't remember committing, crimes that exist only in the gaps between forms, in the spaces where one regulation contradicts another, and both are punishable by death. At precisely the 16th hour, I stood before the elevator that descended to sublevel 7. The operator, a half-servitor whose humanity ended at the shoulders, keyed in the appropriate code without my asking. We descended in silence, broken only by the grinding of ancient machinery and the operator's rhythmic breathing, which might have been mechanical or might have been something else. The doors opened onto a corridor I had never seen, lined with doors that had no numbers, no markings, nothing to distinguish one from another, except slight variations in the rust patterns on their frames. I found the room of verifications not through any sign, but because one door was open, light spilling out in a yellow rectangle that seemed too bright, too warm for the depths of the hive. Inside, a woman waited. She wore the black body glove of the Inquisitorial service, though she wore no rosette, no obvious sign of authority. Her face was ageless in the way of those who have access to rejuvenate treatments, and her eyes were augmented, the irises replaced with brass-rimmed lenses that clicked and whirred as they focused on me. "Administrator Vess," she said, and her voice was pleasant, conversational. "Please, sit." There was only one chair in the room, a simple thing of metal and worn leather. I sat. She remained standing, circling behind me, so I had to twist my neck to follow her movement. The room contained a desk, empty except for a single data slate. The walls were bare. The light came from panels in the ceiling that buzzed faintly, irregularly, in a rhythm that sounded almost like breathing. "You have been observed," she continued, still circling, her boots making no sound on the floor, "for 43 days. Though you only became aware of our attention 14 days ago, when we allowed you to find the mark." My throat closed. I tried to speak, to protest, to explain, but she raised one hand, the motion gentle, almost maternal. "You are not accused of anything, Administrator. Not yet. We simply wish to understand. Tell me about the smell." And I did. "Emperor, help me." I told her everything. The words poured out of me in a rush, tripping over each other. desperate to prove my innocence, my loyalty, my horror at what had happened. I described the dreams, the mark, the way Pavel's eyes had changed, the woman in the prayer cell, whose face had crawled. She listened without interrupting, her augmented eyes clicking softly, recording every word, every hesitation, every inflection. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she walked to the desk and activated the data slate. An image appeared, rotating slowly in the projection field. It was the symbol from my workstation, but enlarged, detailed, annotated with high Gothic text I couldn't read. "Do you know what this is?" she asked. "A mark of chaos," I whispered, because there was no other answer. Yes and no. This symbol is a test, Administrator Vess. One we have administered to 417 individuals in this hive over the past year. It is etched using a compound that produces mild psychoactive effects in those with certain genetic markers. The smell, the dreams, the visual distortions, all expected reactions. Of those 417 test subjects, 391 reported the anomalies immediately. 23 failed to report them, but showed no signs of genuine corruption. 3 are currently being purged in the deep cells, their souls already claimed by the ruinous powers. She turned to face me fully, and I saw that she was smiling, though there was no warmth in it. "You, Administrator Vess, present an interesting case. You did not report the anomalies, which suggests corruption or cowardice, yet you showed genuine horror at their presence, which suggests loyalty. You fled from a prayer service, which suggests guilt, yet you ran to your Hab unit, to your Emperor Shrine, which suggests faith. You are balanced perfectly on the edge, a coin still spinning in the air." "I'm loyal," I said, and my voice sounded like a child's, high and thin. "I serve the Emperor. I have always served the Emperor." "Yes," she agreed. "But loyalty is not the same as purity, and purity is not the same as usefulness. Tell me, Administrator Vess, what do you think should happen to you now?" I had no answer. My mind, so accustomed to the precise categorizations of archive work, could not process this question. It was too open, too vast. What did I think? What I thought had never mattered before. I was a functionary, a cog in the great machine of the Imperium. I thought what I was told to think. I did what I was told to do. "I don't know," I finally said. She nodded, as if this was the correct answer. "The Inquisition does not hunt those who are merely guilty, Administrator. The guilty are everywhere, as common as dust. We hunt those who are useful. Your psychological profile suggests a man capable of withstanding considerable pressure while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. Your work record demonstrates meticulous attention to detail. Your failure to report suggests a capacity for deception, which is valuable in certain contexts. Your horror at what you experienced suggests a conscience we can manipulate." She leaned forward, and I could smell her breath clean, medicated, utterly, without the sweetness that had plagued me. "We are not here to punish you, Administrator Vess. We are here to offer you a choice. You may return to your workstation, where we will continue to observe you, continue to test you, until eventually you break, and we are forced to purge you. Or you may accept recruitment into a special administrative unit that serves the Inquisition directly. You will catalog things far more dangerous than grain shipments. You will authenticate documents that could shatter worlds. You will work in archives where the very knowledge you process could corrupt your soul. But you will serve the Emperor more directly than you ever have. You will be useful." The choice was no choice at all, of course. That was the point. The Inquisition hunts you not to kill you, but to trap you, to corner you until the only path forward leads deeper into their service. I understood this, even as I opened my mouth to answer. "I accept," I said. She smiled again, and this time there was something in it that might have been approval, or might have been satisfaction at a successful recruitment. "Excellent. You will report to sublevel 12 tomorrow at the 8th hour. Bring nothing. Tell no one. Your quarters have already been reassigned. Your existence in the archives will be erased from all records within the week. As far as the Imperium is concerned, Administrator Lexical 4th Class Morton died this evening of a brain aneurysm, a tragic but not uncommon occurrence among archive workers who spend too long in the presence of certain data scrolls. What do I call you? I asked, because I needed something concrete, some name to attach to the person who had just unmade my life. You may call me Interrogator Vale, though that is not my name. Names are privileges earned through service. For now, you will be called Designate 37. Numbers are simpler, harder to corrupt, harder to trace. She walked to the door, then paused, looking back at me. One more thing. Designate. The smell. It will never entirely leave you. That is the nature of exposure to even diluted warp taint. You will carry it with you always, a reminder of how close you came to damnation. Some find this motivating, others find it maddening. I trust you will be among the former. She left. The door closed behind her with a sound like a coffin lid. I sat in that chair for what might have been minutes or hours, my mind blank, scrubbed clean by the enormity of what had just occurred. Eventually, the half-servitor operator appeared in the doorway, gesturing for me to follow. We ascended in silence. When the doors opened on the main archive level, it was past the end of shift. The corridors were empty, the workstations dark and abandoned. I walked to my station one final time. The mark was gone, scrubbed so clean that the metal gleamed. On my desk was a single sheet of parchment, folded precisely in thirds. I opened it. Inside was a number, 37. I never returned to my HAB unit. I never collected my belongings, never said goodbye to anyone, never performed the small rituals that mark the end of one life and the beginning of another. I simply walked to the elevator that would take me to sublevel 12, rode it down into the darkness, and stepped out into a corridor lined with doors that had no numbers, no markings, nothing to distinguish one from another, except the slight variations in the rust patterns on their frames. The orientation for new recruits began immediately. There were 12 of us, all designated by numbers, all pulled from different sections of the hive's bureaucracy. We sat in a room lit by failing lumen strips that cast shadows in the wrong directions, and a man whose face I could never quite focus on explained what our service would entail. We would be assigned to various inquisitors as they required administrative support. We would catalogue evidence from heretical cults. We would authenticate confessions extracted under duress. We would process requisitions for materials whose very names were classified. We would work in teams of 2, always watched, always monitored, because the information we handled could corrupt even the pure of heart. The Inquisition, the man said, his voice flat and inflectionless, is the Emperor's mercy made manifest. Every heretic we burn, every traitor we expose, every demon we banish, these are acts of love. You are privileged to participate in this love. You are privileged to give your sanity, your health, perhaps even your soul in service to humanity's survival. Never forget this privilege. Never question it. Doubt is the first step toward corruption, and corruption is the first step toward the pyre. They paired me with Designate 62, a woman who had once worked in the Administratum's astrological department, calculating warp routes for merchant vessels. She was small, compact, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she had already given up sleep as an inefficient use of time. We did not exchange names. We did not speak of our previous lives. We simply began our work, sitting across from each other at a metal table in a room whose dimensions seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at the walls. Our first assignment was to catalogue items recovered from a cult operating in the Underhive. The items arrived in sealed containers, each stamped with warning sigils and purity seals that had been applied by a tech priest whose authentication we had to verify before we could even open them. Inside were ordinary things made terrible by context: a child's doll with too many eyes, a set of prayer beads carved from human teeth, a book bound in leather that I desperately hoped was synthetic. We logged each item, described it in the precise terminology provided in our operational manual, and filed the descriptions in a data vault whose location we were not permitted to know. The smell returned on our third day of work. Not the sweet incense smell from before, but something else sharp, metallic, like fresh blood mixed with ozone. 62 noticed it too. I saw her nostrils flare, saw the way her hands paused over the item. She was cataloguing a mirror that reflected not your face but something standing behind you that wasn't there when you turned around. We did not speak of it. We had been instructed not to speak of any personal experiences or sensory anomalies, to report them instead to our supervisor, a woman known only as Coordinator Theta, who reviewed our work logs and occasionally appeared to issue new assignments. I began to lose track of time. There were no windows in sublevel 12, no natural light, no shift changes to mark the passage of hours. We worked until we were told to stop, slept in narrow cots in shared dormitories, where the other occupants were always different, always numbers, always strangers. I tried to count the days, but gave up after what I thought was a week, but might have been a month. 62 aged visibly, her hair going grey at the temples, her hands developing a tremor that made her handwriting progressively less legible. I wondered if I was aging too, if my face was becoming pinched and hollow like hers, but there were no mirrors in sublevel 12 except the one we had catalogued, and I had no desire to see what it would show me. The work became routine, which was perhaps the most terrifying thing. Handling objects touched by chaos, reading confessions that described acts of depravity I could barely comprehend, viewing picked captures of rituals that should have shattered my sanity. All of it became simply another task to complete, another form to fill out, another entry in an endless ledger. I developed shortcuts, learned to skim the worst sections, trained myself to focus on the administrative details rather than the content. This was survival. This was how you maintained function in the face of the incomprehensible. Interrogator Vale appeared occasionally to review our work. She never spoke to us directly, simply read through our logs on a data slate, making annotations I could not see. Once, she paused at an entry I had written describing a set of wind chimes made from finger bones, and I saw her mouth twitch in what might have been approval or disgust. She looked at me then, her augmented eyes clicking, and I had the sudden certainty that she could see everything, not just my current thoughts, but every thought I had ever had, every secret fear, every moment of doubt, every time I had questioned whether this was truly service to the Emperor or simply a more elaborate form of damnation. The first person broke after 6 weeks, or what I thought was 6 weeks. Designate 49, a man who had once calculated artillery trajectories for the Planetary Defense Force. He started screaming during a routine cataloging session, tearing at his face with his fingernails, shrieking about things crawling inside his skull. They took him away on a gurney, still screaming, and we were instructed to continue our work. His replacement arrived that same day, Designate 49 Mark II, because even madness did not excuse inefficiency in the Emperor's service. 62, and I never discussed it. But after that, we began to watch each other more carefully, alert for signs of the crack that would spread into a break. I noticed when she started mouthing prayers constantly, her lips moving in the liturgies of the Imperial cult, even as her hands logged descriptions of blasphemous texts. She noticed when I began to sort items by color rather than the prescribed categorization system, arranging them in patterns that satisfied some aesthetic sense I didn't know I possessed. We both pretended not to notice. Reporting a co-worker's instability would only accelerate our own processing. Better to maintain the fiction of normalcy, to prop each other up through our shared silence. I want to say there was a moment when I made a conscious choice to abandon my humanity, to become what the Inquisition needed me to be. But there was no such moment. It happened gradually, in 1,000 small compromises, 1,000 tiny deaths of the person I had been. The administrator lexical 4th class, who had taken pride in his precise ledgers, who had found dignity in the monotony of grain shipments he dissolved like salt in water, leaving behind something harder, colder, more useful. The turning point, if there was one, came when they assigned us to process materials from an active investigation. An Inquisitor Interrogator Vale's superior, whose name we were not given, had apprehended a suspected cult leader from the Midhive, and the preliminary interrogation had produced volumes of testimony that required verification and cross-referencing. This was different from cataloging recovered items. This was participation in an active operation, a chance to contribute directly to the Inquisition's holy work. The testimony arrived in data scrolls encrypted with cogitator locks that required 3 separate prayer keys to open. 62 and I worked in shifts, one of us reading while the other verified, switching every 2 hours to prevent fixation. The cult leader, identified only as Subject 17, described a conspiracy that reached from the Underhive all the way to the planetary governor's palace. He named names, provided dates, detailed rituals conducted in sanctified spaces, corrupted by careful insertion of blasphemous elements into official Imperial liturgies. The scope was staggering. If even half of what he confessed was true, the entire planet was compromised, a tumor of corruption masquerading as loyal Imperial authority. But as I read deeper, as I began to cross-reference dates and locations with official records pulled from the main archives, I noticed inconsistencies, small ones. At first, a ritual supposedly conducted on a date when the location was under quarantine for a plague outbreak, a conspirator who had died 2 years before their alleged participation, a meeting place that had been demolished a decade prior. I flagged these discrepancies in my logs, noting them as potential errors in the testimony that might indicate coercion or false confession. Interrogator Vale reviewed my work personally. She studied the flags I had placed, her augmented eyes clicking as they scanned the text, and then she looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "These discrepancies," she said. "What do you think they mean?" It was a test. Everything was always a test. I considered carefully before answering. The subject may have been lying, either to protect the true conspirators or to implicate innocent individuals. Alternatively, the interrogation methods may have produced false memories, or the records themselves may be falsified as part of the conspiracy. All possible, she agreed. But there is a fourth option you have not considered. That Subject 17 is telling the truth as he understands it. But the conspiracy itself exists in a place where conventional chronology does not apply, where rituals conducted yesterday might have effects last year, where participants can attend meetings after their deaths, where buildings demolished in this reality continue to exist in the warp. The room suddenly felt very cold. I understood what she was suggesting, that we were not investigating a simple heretical cult but something far more dangerous, an incursion of chaos that had fractured the normal flow of time and causality. "What do you want me to do?" I asked. "Continue your work. Document everything. Do not attempt to make sense of the impossible. Simply record it with the same precision you would use to catalogue grain shipments. The Inquisition will interpret. You will observe and report." She left, and I returned to my station, where the data scrolls waited with their reality-breaking testimony. 62 looked at me across the table, her eyes wide with something that might have been fear or might have been the beginnings of madness, and I realized she had been listening, that she understood, as I now understood, that we were not processing evidence, but exposing ourselves to the very corruption we were meant to help combat, that the work itself was poisonous, each word we read a potential vector for infection. We continued anyway. What else could we do? The investigation expanded, more subjects brought in, more testimony processed, more impossible contradictions logged and filed. I stopped sleeping properly, dozed fitfully on my cot, with dreams of archives that stretched into infinity, shelves lined with data scrolls that screamed when you touched them, corridors that led backwards into the future and forwards into the past. I woke with the taste of copper in my mouth and the smell, that sweet, cloying smell from my first days of awareness, back in my nostrils, stronger now, mixed with incense and blood. 62 stopped speaking entirely. She communicated only through written notes passed across our work table, her handwriting increasingly erratic, whole sentences scratched out and rewritten, sometimes in High Gothic, sometimes in languages I didn't recognize. I wanted to report her degradation, but I was afraid that if I did, they would replace her with someone new, and I would have to begin again the careful process of mutual survival, the unspoken agreement not to notice each other's unraveling. Then came the day Interrogator Vale summoned me alone. Not to the room of verifications, but to a different room, deeper in sublevel 12, accessed through a door I had passed 100 times without knowing it could open. Inside was not a room but a chapel of sorts, though no sanctioned chapel I had ever seen. The walls were inscribed with high Gothic prayers, but beneath them, visible in the flickering candlelight, were older inscriptions, symbols that predated the Imperium, that might have predated humanity itself. An altar stood at the far end, and on it rested a single object, a book, bound in black leather, closed with a lock of tarnished silver. "This," Vale said from behind me, her voice echoing strangely in the small space, "is what Subject 17 and his conspirators were attempting to create. Not to find, not to summon, but to create. A grimoire that would contain within its pages a complete history of events that had never occurred, written in blood still warm from veins not yet opened, an impossibility made manifest through ritual and will." I stared at the book, and the book stared back, if such a thing could stare. I felt its attention like weight, like drowning, like standing at the edge of an abyss that goes down forever, and also somehow spirals upward into dimensions I couldn't conceptualize. "They succeeded," I said, "though I don't know how I knew this. Partially. The book exists, but it is incomplete. Subject 17 died under interrogation before providing the final rituals. His co-conspirators have all been purged. The book sits here, locked, its contents unknown, its purpose unclear. We cannot destroy it, we have tried, and it simply reforms, the ashes coalescing back into pages. We cannot read it. The first Inquisitor who attempted is still alive, technically, though what is left of his mind might charitably be called fragments. It simply exists, an affront to reality, a wound in the fabric of what is possible." "Why are you showing this to me?" She moved to stand beside me, close enough that I could feel the body heat bleeding through her body glove, and for some reason this tiny human warmth was more terrifying than anything else in that chapel. "Because you are going to catalogue it, designate 37. You are going to write a description of this book, its dimensions, its weight, its bindings, the material of its pages. You are going to do this using the same meticulous attention to detail you brought to grain shipments. You will not open it. You will not attempt to read the inscriptions on its lock. You will simply describe what can be safely observed. And if you succeed, if you can perform this task without losing your mind or your soul, then you will have proven yourself useful in a way that very few ever do." I wanted to refuse. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee back up to the levels where light was real and time moved in only one direction, where the smell of recycled air was honest and grain shipments made sense. But I had made my choice long ago, in the room of verifications, when I had accepted recruitment. Or perhaps the choice had been made even earlier, when I had failed to report the 8-pointed symbol, when I had let fear override duty. Or perhaps there had never been a choice at all, and I had been moving toward this moment since birth, since the moment some faceless administratum functionary had entered my name into the rolls, since the Emperor himself had breathed life into humanity and doomed us all to this eternal struggle against the darkness. I stepped forward. I took the measurement tools Vale provided, a blessed ruler, a sanctified scale, a prayer-treated caliper. I began to work, my hands steady despite the trembling in my soul, my voice reciting the litanies of observation as I noted dimensions in the prescribed format: height, 23 centimeters, width, 17 centimeters, depth, 4 centimeters, though this measurement felt wrong, as if the book was both thicker and thinner than the caliper indicated, as if it contained more space than should be possible within its covers. The leather was human. I knew this without testing. Knew it the way you know when you're being watched, when danger is near. The lock was inscribed with words, I recognized from the operational manual, ancient protective symbols meant to keep something in, not to keep something out. The pages, visible at the edges where they pressed against the binding, were a color that shifted between ivory and gray, between white and the shade of old bone. I worked for what felt like hours but might have been minutes. Time moved strangely in that chapel, the candles burning without consuming their wax, my shadow falling in directions that defied the light sources. Vale watched in silence, her augmented eyes recording everything, and I wondered if she was documenting my success or simply gathering data on how I would fail. When I finished, when I had filled out the complete catalogue form with every required detail, I stepped back and waited for my mind to shatter, for the corruption to take hold, for whatever horror I had invited by this observation to manifest. Nothing happened. I felt tired, drained, as if I had worked a double shift, but I was still myself. Still sane, still capable of thought. Vale took the form from my hands, read it over with those clicking eyes, and then filed it in a lockbox she produced from within her body glove. "Adequate," she said, which might have been the highest praise I ever received. "You may return to your duties. Speak of this to no one, not even designate 62. This cataloguing is now classified at the highest level." I left the chapel, walked back through the corridors of sublevel 12, and found 62 at our shared work table, still processing testimony from the conspiracy case. She looked up as I entered, and I saw in her eyes that she knew something had changed, that I had crossed some threshold from which there was no return. I sat down across from her, picked up the next data scroll in the queue, and returned to work as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. I had looked at an impossible thing and recorded it with the same precision I had once used to catalogue grain shipments. I had proven to the Inquisition that I was useful in a way that transcended mere administrative competence. I had become a person capable of observing the unobservable, of documenting the undocumentable, of maintaining sanity in the face of the insane. This should have filled me with pride. Instead, I felt only a creeping horror at what I had become, at the realization that my capacity for this work was itself a kind of mutation, a warping of the soul that left me functionally indistinguishable from the corruption I was meant to help combat. The investigation concluded 3 days later. The Inquisitor, whose name we never learned, declared the conspiracy successfully neutralized, the cult broken, the survivors purged. Subject 17's remains were incinerated, his ashes scattered in the furnaces of the lower hive. The book remained in its chapel, catalogued but not destroyed, waiting for someone foolish or desperate enough to attempt to open it. We moved on to the next case, the next pile of data scrolls, the next catalogue of recovered items that should not exist. 62 lasted another week before she broke. I found her in the dormitory, standing over her cot, methodically peeling the skin from her forearm with her fingernails, exposing the muscle beneath. She was humming a tune I recognized as part of the Imperial litany, but pitched wrong. The notes bent in directions sound shouldn't go. I reported her immediately, without hesitation, and watched as they took her away on the same gurney that had carried Designate 49. Her replacement arrived the next day. Designate 62 Mark II, a man this time, older, with the kind of stillness that suggested he had already died inside, and simply hadn't noticed yet. We did not speak except to coordinate our work. We did not form the careful bond of mutual survival I had shared with the original 62. We simply processed items, logged testimony, and moved through our days with the mechanical efficiency of servitors, though we retained enough humanity to understand what we had lost. I don't know how long I have been in sublevel 12. Months, certainly. Perhaps years. The tremor in my hands has worsened, and sometimes I see double, my vision splitting to show both the item in front of me and something else, something that exists in the same space, but in a different configuration of reality. The smell has never left, as Interrogator Vale promised. It follows me constantly, that mixture of sweet incense and rot, and I have learned to find comfort in it, the way prisoners grow attached to their chains. I am useful. This is what sustains me. I am useful to the Inquisition, and through them to the Emperor, and through him to humanity. My suffering has purpose. My degradation serves a function. I am a cog in the great machine, and the fact that I am being ground down with every rotation does not diminish my value, it proves it. Interrogator Vale visits less frequently now. When she does, she looks older, or perhaps I am simply seeing her more clearly. The rejuvenate treatments can only do so much, and even inquisitorial agents are not immune to the toll of their work. She brought me a commendation once, a piece of parchment certifying that Designate 37 had performed his duties with exemplary precision. I filed it with the rest of my documentation, though I don't remember where. The order of things has become less important than the continuation of things. Last month, or what I think was last month, they gave me a new task. Not cataloging recovered items or processing testimony, but something different. They showed me recordings of administratum workers in the main archives, men and women performing the same work I had once performed, and asked me to identify which ones were showing signs of corruption, which ones had altered behavior patterns, which ones were staring too long at their workstations, or reacting strangely to smells, or displaying the subtle symptoms I had once displayed before my recruitment. I found 17 possibilities. They confirmed 11. 6 were false positives, workers who were simply tired or ill, or struggling with the normal pressures of archive work. I felt a brief pang of guilt for the 6, knowing they would now be watched, tested, their lives subject to the same examination mine had been. But the guilt was distant, muted, like emotion experienced through thick glass. This is what the Inquisition does when it hunts you. It does not simply kill you or purge you or burn you for heresy. It transforms you into an instrument of its hunting, turns your corruption into a tool for finding others who might be corrupted, makes you complicit in your own damnation and the damnation of everyone you touch. You become the mark you once discovered, the test you once failed, the smell that never leaves. I am writing this, though writing is perhaps too concrete a word for the process of organizing thoughts that may or may not exist outside my own mind, because I believe I am approaching the end. Not death, necessarily, but something else. A transformation, an elevation. Last week, Interrogator Vale asked me if I would be willing to serve directly in the field, to accompany an Inquisitor on an investigation, to catalog evidence in real time rather than processing it in the safety of sublevel 12. I said yes, because what else could I say? Because usefulness is the only virtue I have left. And if I can still be useful, then perhaps I can still be human in some diminished, abraded sense. The Inquisitor I will serve, whose name I still do not know, specializes in cases involving temporal anomalies, which seems appropriate given my experience with the conspiracy case. We will travel to a frontier world where time has begun to move in the wrong directions, where effects precede causes, where the dead walk backwards from their graves into their births. I will observe. I will catalogue. I will maintain my sanity through the same meticulous attention to detail that has sustained me thus far. And when I finally break, because I will break, everyone breaks eventually, I will break in a useful way. They have trained me for this. They have shaped my corruption carefully, pruning away the dangerous elements, cultivating the productive ones. When I fall, I will fall in a direction that serves the Emperor, and someone else will catalogue my remains, will process my testimony, will learn from my degradation how to better identify and recruit the next Designate 37. This is what happens when the Inquisition hunts you. You become the hunter, you become the prey, you become the record of both, filed away in archives that go down forever, that spiral upward into impossible dimensions, that exist in the spaces between what is real and what should never be real. I accept this. I embrace this. I have no other choice. The Emperor protects, they say, but sometimes his protection takes the form of making you into something that no longer needs protection, something so thoroughly integrated into the machinery of survival that your own destruction becomes just another administrative task, documented with precision, filed with care, and ultimately forgotten in the vast indifference of Imperial record-keeping. I report for deployment in 4 hours. I have packed nothing, because I was instructed to bring nothing. I have said goodbye to no one, because there is no one left to say goodbye to. Designate 62 Mark II will receive a new partner, will continue the work without me, will perhaps last longer, or perhaps break sooner, and it will make no difference either way. The smell is very strong today, sweet and cloying and utterly familiar. I breathe it in deeply, let it fill my lungs, let it remind me of everything I have lost and everything I have become. When I exhale, I taste copper and incense, the flavor of consecrated corruption, the sacrament of useful damnation. In 4 hours, I will ascend from sublevel 12 for the first time in how long? I don't remember. I will step into an elevator operated by a half-servitor whose humanity ends at the shoulders. I will ride upward through levels I no longer recognize toward a surface I can barely remember. And somewhere above, in the light of a sun that I once took for granted, the Inquisition will be waiting to deploy me against horrors I cannot yet imagine, to use me as I have agreed to be used, to break me in service to humanity's survival. This is mercy, they tell me. This is love, made manifest. I believe them, because belief is easier than doubt, and doubt is the first step toward corruption, and I cannot afford any more corruption than I already carry. The Emperor protects, even when his protection looks like this.